It began like every other televised town hall, wrapped in the illusion of balance. The lights were soft but strategic, the backdrop draped in patriotic tones. A glossy studio labeled as neutral territory, yet built brick by ideological brick to favor one voice. The crowd didn't wander in from off the street. No, they were chosen, curated. Staffers, donors, interns who could clap on cue and laugh when the teleprompter said so. Every camera angle told you what to feel. Every beat of applause was just believable enough to seem spontaneous. And at the center of it all, Nancy Pelosi, dressed in a flawless white blazer, her signature pearls catching the studio light. She wore the air of royalty disguised as public service. The speaker, the survivor, the myth. She didn't just sit in that chair, she owned it. Years of media protection had crowned her not just a politician, but a brand. Untouchable, polished, practiced. But that night, something was different. Seated just a few feet away was a woman the media had written off. Too young, too bold, too unwilling to bend. Caroline Leavitt. No entourage, no notes, no pre-cleared talking points, just a steady gaze, and the silence of someone who came to do what others wouldn't. And though the host smiled with rehearsed neutrality, though the audience gave Pelosi their standing ovation before a single question was asked, something in the air had changed. It wasn't obvious. Not yet. But the ground was beginning to shift. This wouldn't be a conversation. This would be a confrontation. The show began as expected. The host, a polished centrist with the comfort of an MSNBC contract and the swagger of someone who believed neutrality was a personality, leaned forward with a grin designed for middle America. "We're honored to welcome Speaker Pelosi," he beamed. As the audience broke into a thunder of applause, cameras panned to Pelosi's gracious nod, her smile perfectly measured. "And joining us," the host added, tone dipping ever so slightly, "congressional candidate Caroline Leavitt." No applause followed, only a polite smattering, the kind reserved for people the crowd had already decided not to like. The host continued, lacing the opening remarks with compliments for Pelosi's leadership in turbulent times and her defense of democracy. The questions were slow-pitched softballs. "Madam Speaker, how do you reflect on your legacy in the face of rising political extremism?" Pelosi didn't blink. She launched into a monologue so polished it sounded rehearsed in a mirror. She spoke of January 6th, of the threats we survived, of Trump, whom she labeled as the greatest domestic danger of our time. The audience clapped with mechanical fervor. A few stood. The camera caught them. But the camera didn't stay there. It cut to Caroline. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't blink. The contrast was unmistakable. This wasn't the behavior of a woman invited to play along. This was the calm before a shift. And behind her stillness was something dangerous, resolve. The kind that doesn't need to yell to be heard. The kind that waits until the noise is deafening before it whispers the one thing no one wants to hear. In a room calibrated for performance, silence became its own kind of noise. Pelosi went on. She spoke of unity, of defending democratic norms, of MAGA extremism, of dangerous rhetoric wrapped in flags. Her voice warmed with each point, carried on applause and legacy. It was familiar, safe, crafted. But the studio wasn't reacting the way it usually did. Yes, the applause still came, but something underneath it trembled. A nervous energy had entered the frame, something unspoken, but felt. And that something was Caroline Leavitt. She hadn't said a word. She hadn't even shifted in her seat. But the stillness was no longer passive. It was surgical. It was the silence of a drawn bowstring, the breath before a verdict. Pelosi, shielded for decades by flattering profiles and choreographed interviews, didn't notice at first. But the audience did. The director did. Even the host, now leaning back ever so slightly, noticed. It was the kind of moment that doesn't show up in transcripts, but every viewer at home could feel it. Something was about to break. Then it happened. The host, likely following a prompt from the control room, turned to Caroline with that practiced smile, the kind TV anchors reserve for the underdog they expect to keep quiet. "Caroline," he said with rehearsed charm, "how do you respond to Speaker Pelosi's view that Donald Trump represents the greatest threat to our democracy?" Caroline didn't flinch. She leaned forward, not with aggression but precision. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Speaker Pelosi," she said, calm as glass, "you're not afraid of Donald Trump. You're afraid of what he represents, unfiltered truth." The air shifted. There was no applause, no rebuttal, just a room suddenly aware that it had stopped breathing. Pelosi blinked. The host looked to his notes. The audience waited, uncertain. And Caroline continued, "You speak of democracy, yet for years you've silenced voices, managed narratives, and labeled dissent as extremism. What you fear isn't chaos. It's accountability." A murmur rippled through the room. Not outrage, recognition. Caroline didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The first crack had appeared, not in Pelosi's response, in her silence. And as the speaker adjusted her pearls and opened her mouth to speak, even she knew this wasn't going to be like the last time. This time the script wasn't hers to control. Pelosi smiled tightly, the kind of smile worn not from joy but from instinct. For years that smile had been her armor. It was there during hearings, while signing bills, even while tearing speeches on live television. It had worked, until now, because something was happening in the room. The applause that once followed her every sentence had thinned. The laughter, once convenient and punctual, had faded into uncomfortable silence. And across from her sat Caroline Leavitt, calm as ever, her presence no longer tolerated but undeniable. The cameras were still rolling, but they no longer served Pelosi. They gravitated to Caroline, who hadn't demanded the spotlight, but had quietly seized it. There was no interruption, no grandstanding, just a shift, subtle, then seismic. "The truth doesn't need a teleprompter," Caroline continued. "It doesn't need curated audiences or studio applause. The truth just needs a place to stand, and I'm standing right here." The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not because of what was said, but because he knew the show had lost control. Caroline was no longer a guest. She was the gravity in the room. It began with a question, but not from the host. Caroline turned slightly, not toward Pelosi, but toward the viewers at home. "Let's talk about January 6th, she said. The studio fell into a deeper silence. Not the kind of silence that came with boredom or delay, but the kind that came with discomfort, with anticipation. Pelosi's spine straightened, her jaw tightened. "Is it true," Caroline asked, measured and deliberate, "that Capitol Police and federal officials made multiple offers to deploy the National Guard ahead of that day, and you refused?" The host raised a hand as if to interject, but stopped himself. He knew that once the courtroom emerged, he couldn't overrule the judge. And that night, the judge wasn't sitting behind a bench. She was sitting across from the Speaker of the House. Pelosi offered her standard response. "Security decisions were made by the appropriate officials," she said, her voice more clipped than before. But Caroline didn't blink. "And who did they report to?" she asked. It wasn't rhetorical. "You were the highest-ranking official in the House. You received the briefings. You saw the requests. But the Guard wasn't mobilized until it was too late. And that wasn't a failure. That was a decision." The weight of those words didn't need elaboration. The room knew it. The audience at home felt it. Even Pelosi, who had built her legacy on controlling the narrative, couldn't spin it fast enough. For the first time, her silence was not calculated. It was involuntary. Silence lingered like smoke. Caroline didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just let the moment breathe, because she understood what the viewers did. You don't fill truth with noise, you let it echo. Then she pivoted. Now let's talk about October 2020, she said. The laptop. Pelosi's eyes twitched, not in anger, but in recognition. She knew what was coming, and she wasn't ready. You knew it was real. The FBI had it. The emails were verified, the photos authenticated. But instead of transparency, we got a letter signed by 51 intelligence officials labeling it disinformation. And within hours, the story vanished. She paused, not for drama, but for accuracy. Facebook throttled it, Twitter banned it, YouTube scrubbed it, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. The host inhaled to speak, but Caroline wasn't done. That wasn't a national security decision, that was a political security move, and you, Madam Speaker, were right in the center of it. The audience didn't gasp. It didn't need to, because every viewer already knew what she said was true. They'd lived it, watched it happen in real time, and then were told they imagined it. Caroline had done more than accuse. She'd reminded them of what they weren't allowed to say. Pelosi was already off balance, but Caroline wasn't finished, because in Washington, legacy is only half the illusion. The other half is wealth. Let's talk about timing, Caroline said, her voice steady. Specifically the timing of a certain semiconductor investment. Pelosi blinked. Your husband, Paul Pelosi, purchased up to $5 million in NVIDIA stock just weeks before Congress passed the CHIPS Act, a bill you not only supported but personally lobbied for. The host coughed. The control room cut to a wide shot, but the damage was already pulsing through the audience. That bill handed billions in federal subsidies to chip makers like NVIDIA, Caroline added. It inflated their stock, and your household directly profited. She didn't accuse. She documented. She didn't dramatize. She delivered. Pelosi opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Caroline continued. And it wasn't the first time. Over your tenure, your family's net worth ballooned. Not through innovation, not through invention, but through access. No one interrupted. Not the host, not the producers, not the speaker, because they couldn't. And Caroline, without changing tone, delivered the blow that had been years in the making. You don't get to call yourself a public servant while serving your portfolio first. The crowd didn't cheer, but they remembered every word, every number, every pause. And for the first time in her long political life, Nancy Pelosi didn't own the room. Caroline did. For a moment, it looked like Pelosi might regain her footing. The host attempted to redirect. Let's move on to climate policy, he offered, voice brittle, as if offering a rope to someone already sinking. Pelosi reached for it, nodding slightly, relief flickering in her eyes. But Caroline didn't let her off the hook. Her voice dropped a tone, not louder, lower, sharper, more final. If you can't answer basic questions about your record, she said, you don't get to define the future of the United States. Boom! The words didn't explode. They landed. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence wasn't respectful. It was stunned. The host sat frozen, his fingers gripping his notes like a lifeline. The control room stopped switching cameras, and Pelosi, the master of moments, the queen of stagecraft, stared ahead, not at Caroline, not at the audience, but at the floor. Because what do you do when the pageantry is peeled away? What happens when the well-trained lines don't work? When the applause lights stay dark? When your opponent refuses to play the part of the polite conservative who loses with grace? You shrink. Pelosi reached for the oldest shield in Washington, ambiguity. I don't recall the specifics, she said, then fumbling further. There were committees, staff decisions, many moving parts. But Caroline didn't respond. She didn't have to, because by now every viewer knew what those phrases meant. Not clarity, not truth, just survival. The tension didn't snap. It settled. There was no sudden climax, no screaming, no slamming fists on the table. That wasn't Caroline's way. Her final act wasn't performance, it was quiet reckoning. "You say you defend democracy," she said, voice still even, "but what we've seen is narrative management. We've seen platforms censored, questions forbidden, dissent labeled as danger, all under the guise of protecting the people." Pelosi shifted, not to fight, to endure. "You silenced opposition while claiming victimhood. You funded wars while preaching peace. You grew your fortune behind closed doors while lecturing the country on sacrifice." She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. That's not democracy. That's a costume. The line didn't need applause. It needed remembrance. Caroline leaned back, her point made, not scored, made, no victory lap, no gloating, because for her the win wasn't in humiliation, it was in illumination. And for the first time the nation saw the speaker not as an icon, but as a person. And not just a person, a politician, exposed, not by rumor, not by rage, but by record. The host cleared his throat. "Let's take a quick break," he said, his voice nearly trembling. But it was too late. The break had already happened. The illusion was broken, and the verdict had already been delivered. That night, millions watched a moment they weren't supposed to see, not in politics, not in media, a moment where choreography failed, where power didn't win, where truth didn't shout. It simply stood its ground. Caroline Leavitt didn't storm the stage. She didn't scream. She didn't grandstand. She asked the questions no one else would, and she waited for answers that never came. Because when you carry the truth, you don't have to raise your voice. You just have to refuse to lower your standards. And now, the question isn't whether Pelosi lost a debate. The question is, what else have we let them get away with? If this story made you pause, if it made you remember or reconsider, don't scroll past. Share it, talk about it, replay it, let them know you saw what they hoped you missed. Subscribe for more stories the media won't tell you, because truth isn't trending, but it's still powerful. And we're just getting started.